A tiny piece of steel called a frog was supposed to be routine railroad hardware. In 1883, it became a trigger. Two rail empires fought over one crossing at Colton, using judges, deputies, and hired guns. A locomotive was shoved onto the exact spot like a barricade. Then Virgil Earp stepped onto the track, waiting to see who blinked first. "Hello, I'm William. Let's get into it." Railroads didn't compete like normal businesses in the Gilded Age. They competed like governments. If you controlled the only practical route into a region, you controlled the prices, the timing, and which towns grew or died. Southern Pacific had that grip on Southern California. It owned the main lines, the connections, and the political relationships that made no feel like the natural answer. In San Bernardino County, people didn't talk about market share. They talked about permission. Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe wanted in, and it wasn't coming in quietly. Its local arm, the California Southern, was pushing north with one purpose: break the gate and reach the markets that Southern Pacific had treated like its private territory. Here's what made Colton so dangerous. The geography forced a decision. To move north the way Santa Fe wanted, its track had to cross Southern Pacific's track at one specific point. Not nearby, not later. Right there. And crossing a railroad line isn't a handshake. It's a legal right, a construction job, and a physical moment where both sides can show up with men. The frog is the piece of iron that makes that crossing possible. It's the shaped steel that lets a wheel flange pass through an intersection without jumping the track. It sounds small until you realize it's the key that unlocks the entire region. Southern Pacific treated that key like contraband. The dirty moves started with paper, delays, court filings, claims that the crossing was unsafe, unauthorized, or improperly planned. Anything that bought time, because time is what a monopoly sells. Every week, the crossing didn't exist. Southern Pacific's grip stayed intact. Santa Fe answered with its own paperwork and its own crews. Surveyors marked lines. Work gangs brought ties, spikes, and iron. The plan was simple: arrive fast, build faster, and make the crossing a fact before the other side could stop it. Then it stopped being legal and became physical. Southern Pacific began using the track itself as a weapon, not by tearing up Santa Fe's work in public, by controlling access, by forcing delays at the exact place where the iron had to go, by turning a construction site into a contested border. In Colton, that border sat in the open, under sun and dust, close enough that locals could watch the whole thing like a street fight, forming in slow motion. Railroad men started arriving who weren't there to swing hammers. They were there to stand still and stare. The towns around the crossing felt the pressure immediately. Shopkeepers, teamsters, and warehouse men knew what a second railroad could mean: lower freight rates, more buyers, and a future that didn't require Southern Pacific's approval. Others feared the opposite: chaos, violence, and a powerful company taking revenge. And then the monopoly made its clearest move. A Southern Pacific locomotive rolled in and stopped on the precise spot where the crossing had to be installed, as if steel could veto steel. The engine didn't just block a track. It blocked an entire rival's path into the region, daring anyone to move it. Santa Fe didn't answer the locomotive with speeches. It answered with a court order and a work gang. California Southern's lawyers pushed for the one thing that mattered more than arguments: the right to cross. Papers were filed, hearings held, and suddenly the fight had a stamp on it. The crossing was permitted. On paper, Southern Pacific was supposed to step aside. On the ground, Southern Pacific treated the paper like a joke. The construction crew arrived with the hardware that makes a crossing real. Rails cut to length, spikes, plates, heavy wrenches, and the frog itself, a chunk of shaped steel that looks harmless until you realize it's a key. They didn't come like a parade. They came like a raid. Quick, focused, and ready to work fast before the other side could react. Southern Pacific was already there. The locomotive sat on the exact point where the frog had to be set, and it didn't sit quietly. Engineers in the cab inched it forward, then back, then forward again, always keeping weight on the spot. Every time the crew tried to measure, the engine moved. Every time they tried to place a tie, a steel wheel rolled over the line. It was the cleanest kind of obstruction. No fists, no gunfire. Just a machine doing what machines do, used as a moving lock. Santa Fe's men tried to work around it. They edged closer with tools, looking for a gap, a moment when the wheels lifted off the precise intersection. But a locomotive doesn't need to chase you to win. It only needs to keep occupying the one square of ground you must have. So the standoff escalated into what these wars always become. More men. Southern Pacific hired muscle to stand near the engine and the track. Not in uniforms, in everyday clothes, with rifles and shotguns that were carried low but visible. The message was not subtle. Touch the engine, and this becomes something else. Santa Fe answered by bringing its own protection. Deputies were called. Local men showed up with picks and shovels like they were going to build, but everyone could see they were there to choose a side if it turned. Colton started to fill. Railroad rivalries always pull in towns, because towns don't see a crossing. They see freight rates. They see jobs. They see whether merchants get cheaper shipments and whether farms get a better price for moving goods. A second line meant leverage against Southern Pacific's grip. That alone was enough to turn spectators into a crowd with opinions. And crowds don't stay neutral when guns are present. Someone would wave the court order and shout that the work was legal. Someone else would shout that the track was Southern Pacific property. The locomotive would creep again, slow and stubborn, like it was answering the yelling with steel. This is where the war gets dirty in a specific Gilded Age way. It's not just violence. It's using authority like a weapon. Southern Pacific leaned on local influence and delay tactics. If they could stall long enough, a judge might reconsider. A sheriff might hesitate. A crew might get tired. A crowd might get impatient and do something that makes Santa Fe look like the aggressor. Santa Fe tried to do the opposite. Make the crossing a fact. Once the frog is bolted in, the argument changes. You're no longer begging for access. You're defending installed track. But the locomotive kept denying them that moment. By now, the scene had the feel of a street fight that hasn't thrown the first punch yet. Men shifting their weight, hands too close to holsters. Work tools on the ground that could be used for work or something else. The engine hissing, as if the machine itself was irritated at being forced to play human games. That's when Southern Pacific brought in a name that carried its own warning. Virgil Earp. Not a rail executive, not a politician. A lawman for hire with a reputation that made people stand a little straighter. His job wasn't to negotiate. It was to hold the line, keep the engine where it was, and make sure nobody forgot the cost of pushing too hard. In a fight over a piece of steel, Southern Pacific had chosen to put a man like Earp on the track. That told everyone in Colton the same thing. This wasn't ending with paperwork. Virgil Earp didn't arrive to negotiate. He arrived to freeze the scene. He was a famous name from a different kind of frontier, hired now as muscle with legal cover. Southern Pacific didn't need him to fire. It needed him to stand where everyone could see him and make the crowd doubt itself. Earp took his position near the blocked crossing like it was a doorway. The locomotive sat over the exact point where the frog had to go, steam drifting from the valves, metal ticking as it cooled and warmed. Around it, Southern Pacific men held shotguns and rifles, in the casual way that tells you they've already decided what the answer is. Santa Fe's crew came in with tools and the court paper that said they had the right to build. They were workers first, but they weren't naive. They brought their own deputies, their own supporters, and men who weren't there to swing hammers unless the hammers had to become something else. Colton wasn't big, but that day it felt like a capital. Word traveled through saloons, stores, and rail offices. Merchants showed up because a second railroad meant cheaper freight and more buyers. Teamsters showed up because their wages lived on schedules. Farmers showed up because Southern Pacific's rates had been the price of admission for years. On one side, people spoke the language of monopoly without using the word. They can't keep doing this. They can't own everything. On the other side, people spoke the language of authority. It's their track. You don't tear up a main line because you got a piece of paper. Then the legal paper was raised like a flag. A man read the order out loud, loud enough for the cab to hear. The crossing had been permitted. The crew had a right to install it. The locomotive needed to move. Earp didn't flinch. He didn't argue law like a lawyer. He argued it like a man hired to delay. He asked who was going to move the engine, who was going to step onto a rail line in front of armed men and take responsibility for what happens next. And that's when the war became visible. Not corporate, not abstract, visible. The Santa Fe crew edged forward with measuring tools, trying to find a window where the wheels weren't sitting on the mark. Southern Pacific answered by inching the locomotive again, slow and deliberate, the steel weight never leaving the crossing point. The message was pure control. You can't build because we won't let the ground exist. People in the crowd started picking up stones without thinking. That's how these things go wrong. Someone wants to throw. Someone wants to stop him. Someone else takes a hand off a rifle, and everything shifts. Earp watched the crowd like he'd watched men outside a saloon door. He didn't need to threaten the whole town. He only needed to make one example. He positioned himself so he could be seen by both sides, and he let the pause stretch until everyone could hear the locomotive hissing. Then Southern Pacific did another dirty thing. It tried to turn the scene into a trap for Santa Fe. If Santa Fe's men touched the engine, Southern Pacific could claim sabotage. If Santa Fe's crowd surged, Southern Pacific could claim riot. If someone fired from the Santa Fe side first, Southern Pacific could claim self-defense and justify whatever came next. The locomotive wasn't just a barricade. It was bait. Santa Fe's people knew it too. They wanted the crossing, but they didn't want to hand Southern Pacific the story. So they tried to keep it procedural. Deputies pushed the crowd back. The crew waited for a clean moment to work. Someone rode out to find higher authority, someone who could bring a bigger badge than Virgil Earp's reputation. That's where Robert Waterman enters the picture. Waterman wasn't a railroad man. He was the governor of California, and his involvement meant the fight had grown too loud to be treated like a local dispute. When a governor shows up around a rail crossing, It's because somebody with money and influence has already been calling him, and somebody else has been calling him back. Now everyone waited for the same thing, not a compromise, an order with teeth. The sun kept climbing. Dust stuck to sweat. Men stood too close to each other with weapons they didn't want to use, but didn't want to put down. The work gang still had the frog and spikes sitting ready, useless until the wheels moved. And Virgil Earp stayed on the line, calm enough to make everyone else feel unstable, while the locomotive's steel weight sat exactly where the crossing had to be. By midday, Colton Crossing had stopped being a construction site. It was a public test of who ran Southern California. Southern Pacific kept the locomotive planted like a steel foot. The engineer would ease it forward a few inches, then back again, always keeping the wheels on the exact point where the frog had to be set. It was petty, but it worked. You can't bolt a crossing into place while a train is sitting on the wound. Santa Fe tried to keep the moment clean. They kept flashing the court order, kept their crew ready, kept deputies between the work gang and the loudest men in the crowd. They wanted Southern Pacific to look like the one refusing the law, because that mattered as much as the rails. Southern Pacific wanted the opposite. If the crossing turned into a brawl, they could call it sabotage. If a shot came from the Santa Fe side first, they could call it self-defense. The locomotive wasn't just blocking steel. It was setting a trap where the first mistake could be framed as a crime. Virgil Earp stood in the middle of that trap like he owned it. He talked to the deputies as if they were junior men. Calm voice, short sentences, eyes that didn't move much. He didn't threaten anyone directly. He simply made it clear that moving the engine meant stepping into a fight you couldn't unwind later. The longer it dragged, the more the crowd started behaving like a crowd. Men climbed onto ties for a better view. Someone spat toward the locomotive. Someone else laughed too loudly. A few rifles that had been held low shifted higher, not aimed, just raised enough to change the air. Then a local official arrived with a new piece of authority, and the tone snapped again. A sheriff's man read out another order, louder this time, and pointed at the crossing point. Move the engine. Allow the installation. The words hung there, useless, because an order doesn't lift steel unless someone is willing to enforce it. Arp looked at the paper like it was weather. Then he looked at the men behind him, and the men behind him didn't move. Southern Pacific had hired them to hold the line, and they were holding it. Santa Fe's crew tightened up. The frog and spikes were sitting a few yards away like a promise that couldn't be kept. Workmen kept glancing at the tools, then at the engine, then at the rifles. Nobody wanted to be the first man to step onto that rail and touch anything. That's when the fight climbed up the chain to the only place it could go next. Telegraph messages went out to Sacramento. The words weren't dramatic. They didn't have to be. A rival railroad is blocking a legal crossing with a locomotive. Armed men are gathering. A famous lawman is in the middle of it. If the state doesn't step in, the town will. And when the name Robert Waterman started circulating through the crowd, you could feel both sides stiffen. A governor doesn't get involved because he cares about a frog. He gets involved because railroads are too powerful to ignore, and because a shooting at a crossing would turn a business war into a statewide scandal overnight. So the waiting began again, heavier than before. Southern Pacific kept the engine in place, as if daring the state to touch it. Santa Fe kept the crew ready, as if daring the engine to move. The crowd held its breath in that dusty heat, staring at a single point of steel where one crossing would decide who owned the route. Late afternoon, The air over Colton Crossing felt heavy and electric. Not from wires, from men who had been standing too long with nothing to do but wait. Then the mood shifted, the way it always does when real authority arrives. A carriage rolled in with officials around it. Sheriff's men first, then a tighter cluster of suits and badges. Robert Waterman had finally stepped into a fight that neither railroad could afford to lose in public. Waterman didn't look like a man interested in drama. He looked like a man interested in ending it before it stained the whole state. He walked straight to the rails, took the papers, and read them as if the crowd wasn't there. The locomotive hissed beside him, still squatting on the crossing point like a claim. He didn't argue the history. He didn't negotiate territory. He went right to the only question that mattered. Move the engine. Southern Pacific's people didn't move. The engineers stayed in the cab. The men with rifles stayed where they were. The crowd tightened because everyone recognized the next step. If the governor's order failed, the crossing would be decided by whoever was willing to shoot first. Virgil Earp stepped in before it broke. He approached Waterman and spoke low, like he was trying to keep the temperature from spiking. Earp's posture said he was in charge of the ground. Waterman's posture said he was in charge of the consequences. For a few seconds, it looked like a stare-down between two kinds of power. Waterman made it simple. The crossing is authorized. The state will enforce it. Anyone who blocks it will be treated as obstructing the law, not defending property. He didn't shout it. He didn't need to. The sheriff's men behind him were the punctuation. Earp understood the trap immediately. If he forced a confrontation with the governor standing there, Southern Pacific wouldn't look strong. It would look lawless. And lawless is the one label a railroad monopoly can't afford when it wants judges and legislators on its side next week. Still, he held his position, because his job was to hold the line until the company gave him a reason to step back. He turned toward the locomotive, then toward the armed men, and you could see him weighing it. Not courage, cost. The governor's people walked to the cab. They didn't climb up like attackers. They climbed up like men serving notice. A short exchange followed, sharp enough that even the crowd could feel it. Then the engineer's hand moved, and the locomotive gave a reluctant cough of steam. For a second, it looked like the engine might creep forward again, one last petty inch. The crowd reacted like a muscle, surging and then stopping, because rifles shifted on both sides. A deputy raised a hand and shouted for space. A Southern Pacific guard took a half step that made 3 men behind him tighten their grips. Earp turned and snapped a command, quick and cold. Hold! Don't move! That's likely the moment that saved Colton from a shooting. Not because everyone suddenly became reasonable, but because the man paid to be dangerous decided this was the wrong day to prove it. The locomotive finally backed off the crossing point. Steel wheels rolled away from the exact spot they'd been guarding for hours. The engine didn't retreat far. It didn't have to. It only had to give the work crew 1 clean minute. Santa Fe's men didn't waste it. The crew rushed in with the frog like it was a prize being carried across a battlefield. Tools hit the ground. Measurements were shouted. Ties were positioned. Spikes were driven hard and fast. You could hear the hammer blows over the engine's hiss, and that sound changed everything. It turned the crossing from an argument into a build. Southern Pacific's guards watched, angry and helpless, because now any interference would be interference with the governor's order. The monopoly had been forced into a new posture. It could still fight in court. It could still delay later. But it couldn't stop steel from being set into place under a line of deputies. Earp stayed close, eyes scanning the crowd more than the workers. His job had shifted from blocking the crossing to preventing a riot from happening while it was installed. He wasn't protecting Southern Pacific anymore. He was protecting the moment from becoming a headline that ruins everyone. The frog went down. The rails were fitted. Bolts were tightened until the metal groaned. Then came the brief silence right before the test, when everyone waits to see if the build holds, or if the whole thing turns into a wreck. A locomotive rolled forward slowly, almost respectfully, and its wheels crossed the new intersection. No jump, no derail, no disaster, just steel passing steel. The crowd didn't cheer like a parade. It exhaled like a storm passing. But Southern Pacific hadn't lost the bigger war yet. It had only lost the right to say never. And in a railroad empire, once never breaks, every other boundary becomes negotiable. Once the wheels crossed the frog without jumping, the whole standoff lost its magic. Southern Pacific couldn't claim the crossing was impossible. It couldn't claim Santa Fe's crew was sabotaging the main line. The hardware was in. The rail was aligned. The law had been enforced in daylight, with the governor watching. But don't mistake that for surrender. This is how rail empires survive losing a moment. They retreat into delay, paperwork, and retaliation that doesn't leave a body on the ties. Southern Pacific still had lawyers. It still had judges it knew. It still had influence in towns where a depot meant votes and money. The fight that failed on the track could continue in court. The difference was that the monopoly wall had a crack you could measure. Before Colton, Southern Pacific could say no and make it stick. After Colton, it had to say no in a way that didn't look like open defiance. That subtle shift matters in the Gilded Age because the companies aren't only selling freight. They're selling legitimacy. You can see it in how fast everyone tried to control the story. Southern Pacific's people wanted the day remembered as them preventing chaos. Santa Fe wanted it remembered as them breaking a chokehold. Waterman wanted it remembered as the state restoring order before blood was spilled. Virgil Earp wanted it remembered as him keeping a mob from turning a rail crossing into a graveyard. And Earp's presence is the detail that makes the whole conflict feel like a Western, even though it was a corporate war. He wasn't hired to build anything. He was hired to make the ground feel dangerous. He did his job so well that the loudest men in the crowd kept checking their own hands. When the governor forced the engine back, Earp didn't lose in a gunfight. He lost to a bigger badge and the cost of becoming the headline. That's the dirty lesson at Colton. Railroads will use courts to slow you, and if courts don't work, they'll use steel. If steel doesn't work, they'll use men with rifles to make you blink. And if that still doesn't work, they'll step aside just enough to avoid looking lawless, then punish you later with rates, schedules, and politics. The frog went in anyway. A crossing that should have been a footnote became a turning point because it proved something out loud. Southern California didn't have to be one company's private map forever. Another line could get in, another rate could exist. Another town could negotiate instead of begging. You can feel the aftermath in one quiet image: the sun dropping behind dust and telegraph poles. The crowd thinning out into small groups that talk too fast, like they're still shaking. Waterman leaving with the certainty that he prevented a shooting. Railroad men packing tools back into wagons, hands sore, faces tight. Virgil Earp stepping off the rail, holstering, and walking away from a corporate fight that almost turned into a massacre. And in the middle of it all, that small piece of steel sits in the track, doing its job. Not glamorous, not loud, just a permanent intersection where two empires were forced to touch. Like the video, subscribe, and comment. Where are you watching from? This is where we follow old money power games all the way down to the ground. If you watched the video to the end, do you think Waterman saved Colton from bloodshed?